Before the fear begins, hit like and subscribe, don't miss the chills. Tell us where you're watching from, and brace yourself for stories so terrifying, they'll haunt your night. The sun hung low in the horizon, its final rays streaking the landscape with burnt orange and deep crimson, as Ethan Cross eased his car onto the narrow, winding road. He had been driving for hours, and exhaustion pressed against him like a suffocating weight. The GPS, mounted precariously on the dashboard, blinked its dim light with a taunting sense of calm, even as it continued to reroute him. "This can't be right," Ethan muttered, glancing at the screen. The directions were leading him into unfamiliar territory. It had been a straightforward journey, just a quick detour to clear his head on the way to his sister's house in the next state, but now he found himself navigating through desolation. The road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by dense forests on either side. Shadows slithered between the trees, the branches gnarled and grasping like skeletal fingers. Every so often, Ethan caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, though when he turned to look, there was nothing but the whisper of leaves in the wind. The forest opened up abruptly, spilling Ethan into a clearing. His foot instinctively eased off the gas pedal as he caught sight of a town that seemed to materialize from the mist itself. Small, quaint buildings lined the cobblestone streets, their exteriors pristine as if painted anew. A single wooden sign stood at the edge of the clearing, swaying slightly in the breeze. "Welcome to Somnolence," it read in perfectly carved letters. Beneath it, in smaller, faded script, the words "A place to rest." Ethan's brow furrowed as he slowed to a stop. He didn't recall seeing this town on the map, or any map, for that matter. Yet, there it was, tucked away in the wilderness, exuding an unsettling stillness. The GPS had gone silent, the little blue dot frozen on the screen as though the device had given up. Desperation clawed at him. His phone had barely 1 bar of service, and the fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. He had no choice but to stop, at least for the night. As he drove into the town, the perfection of it all began to unsettle him. The streets were empty but immaculate, without a single crack or piece of litter. The houses were identical in their symmetry: white picket fences, red brick chimneys, and curtains drawn tightly over the windows. Flower beds lined every yard, blooming unnaturally bright in the dimming light. He pulled up to the town square, a small roundabout encircling a grand clock tower that loomed over the buildings. Its hands were frozen at 6:13. Ethan stepped out of the car, stretching his stiff legs. The air was strangely still, thick with an unnatural quiet that seemed to swallow every sound. Even his footsteps felt muted as he approached a nearby building with a sign that read Somnolence Inn. The bell above the door jingled faintly as he entered. The room smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Behind the counter stood a woman, her smile wide and practiced, like a porcelain doll come to life. "Welcome," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "We don't get many visitors these days." "I wasn't planning on stopping," Ethan admitted, scratching the back of his neck. "But I'm low on gas, and I could use a place to stay for the night." The woman's smile didn't falter. "We have a room ready for you. Always." Something about the way she said it sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He glanced at the guest book lying on the counter. Its pages were pristine, unmarked by signatures or dates, as though no one had stayed here in years. "You'll be in room 3, the woman continued, sliding a brass key across the counter. "Breakfast is served at 7 sharp. Please enjoy your stay." Ethan took the key, her unwavering smile following him as he ascended the narrow staircase to the second floor. The hallway stretched unnaturally long, lined with doors that seemed to hum faintly. Room 3 was at the very end. The room itself was small but cozy, with a neatly made bed and a window overlooking the town square. He noticed a single painting on the wall, a serene depiction of the town, the clock tower in the center. Oddly, the hands on the painted clock were also frozen at 6:13. As he set his bag down, a peculiar sound reached his ears, a faint humming, low and rhythmic, emanating from somewhere outside. He moved to the window, peering into the dimly lit square. A group of townsfolk had gathered there, standing motionless, their faces turned upward toward the clock tower. Ethan's breath caught. They stood perfectly still, their postures rigid, as if they were statues placed there to mimic life. He watched them for several minutes, But they didn't move, not even to shift their weight or scratch an itch. His phone buzzed suddenly, startling him. He fished it out of his pocket, relieved to see a text from his sister. "You coming? Haven't heard from you all day." Ethan quickly typed back, "Car trouble. Stuck in some town called Somnolence. We'll head out in the morning." The reply came almost instantly. "What town? There's nothing out there." Ethan's stomach knotted. He glanced back at the square, but the townsfolk were gone, leaving only the faint hum lingering in the air. The next morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of muffled voices drifting from the square. He dressed quickly and headed downstairs, the innkeeper greeting him with the same porcelain smile. "Did you sleep well?" she asked. "Yeah," Ethan lied, though his dreams had been plagued by shadowy figures and whispers he couldn't understand. "What's going on outside?" "The morning gathering," she replied, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Ethan stepped outside, shielding his eyes from the harsh sunlight. The townsfolk were once again gathered in the square, their expressions placid but empty. They stood in a perfect circle, facing inward, murmuring something he couldn't quite make out. He approached cautiously, their voices growing clearer with each step. "Rest. Repeat. Return. Rest. Repeat. Return." The chant sent a shiver down his spine. One of the townsfolk, a man with a wide-brimmed hat, turned toward him, and for a brief moment, Ethan could have sworn the man's eyes were black voids, empty of anything human. The townsfolk suddenly dispersed, moving in perfect unison as though someone had flipped a switch. They returned to their homes, their movements unnaturally smooth and synchronized. Ethan stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his chest. Something was terribly wrong here. Later that day, Ethan ventured into the town's only diner, hoping to find answers. The waitress greeted him with the same overly wide smile as the innkeeper, her movements mechanical as she poured his coffee. "Busy morning," he said, testing the waters. "We live by routine," she replied, her voice devoid of inflection. "It keeps us whole." Ethan leaned forward. "What's with the clock tower? Why doesn't it work?" The waitress's smile faltered for the first time, her hand trembling as she set down the coffee pot. "It's not broken," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the window. "It's watching." Before Ethan could press further, the door to the diner swung open, and the group of townsfolk from earlier entered, their blank expressions fixed on him. Ethan's heart raced as they surrounded his booth, their eyes devoid of life. He glanced at the waitress, but she had frozen in place, as if stuck in mid-motion. One of the townsfolk, a woman with pale skin and hollow cheeks, leaned in close. "You can't leave," she said softly, her breath cold against his ear. "We don't let anyone leave." The sun dipped behind the hills, and the town of Somnolence was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Ethan stepped out of the diner, his pulse still racing from the encounter with the townsfolk. Their warning, "You can't leave," echoed in his mind, chilling him to the bone. He glanced around the square, now eerily empty once again. The clock tower loomed overhead, its face frozen at 6:13. The faint hum he had heard the night before began to creep into his awareness, a rhythmic drone that seemed to seep into the air itself. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to leave, but his car, parked outside the inn, wouldn't start. He had tried everything, checking the battery, fiddling with the ignition, but it was as if the vehicle had simply died in protest. Desperation clawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the town was alive, its streets and buildings conspiring to keep him trapped. That evening, Ethan returned to the inn, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The innkeeper was waiting for him at the counter, her ever-present smile plastered across her face. "Rough day?" she asked, her voice unnervingly cheerful. "You could say that," Ethan replied cautiously. "My car won't start. Do you know of a mechanic in town?" Her smile faltered, just slightly. "We don't have one. Most of us don't need cars. Everything we need is right here." Ethan frowned. "Then how do people come and go?" Her eyes darkened for a brief moment, her porcelain facade cracking just enough to reveal a flicker of unease. "They don't." Before Ethan could respond, she leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You shouldn't ask too many questions. It's safer that way." Her cryptic warning sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He returned to his room, locking the door behind him. As he sat on the edge of the bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As night fell, Ethan decided to explore the room. There had to be something, anything, that could give him insight into what was happening in somnolence. In the bedside drawer, he found an old leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age. Inside, the handwriting was erratic, as if written in haste or desperation. Day 1. I arrived in somnolence by chance, my car breaking down on the way to the coast. The town seemed normal enough at first, but there's something off about the people here. They smile too much, and their eyes aren't right. Ethan's heart quickened as he read on. Day 3. The clock tower is the key. I'm sure of it. At night, I hear whispers coming from it, though I can't make out the words. I tried to leave today, but the road out of town loops back on itself. There's no escape. Day 5. They're watching me. The townsfolk, they're not human. I don't know what they are, but I need to find out before it's too late. The answers are in the tower. I can feel it. The entries stopped abruptly, the final pages blank. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Whoever had written the journal had come to the same conclusions he was beginning to draw. The clock tower was the center of everything. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan ventured back into the square under the cover of darkness. The hum in the air was louder now, almost oppressive, and the clock tower loomed like a sentinel over the town. As he approached, he noticed movement in the shadows. The townsfolk were gathering again, their forms silhouetted by the dim light of the street lamps. They moved in perfect unison, their footsteps synchronized as they formed a circle around the base of the tower. Ethan hid behind a nearby building, peering out cautiously. The townsfolk began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic. Rest. Repeat. Return. Rest. Repeat. Return. Their words sent a chill down his spine, the cadence hypnotic and unnatural. As they chanted, a faint light began to emanate from the tower, casting long, eerie shadows across the square. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched. The light pulsed in time with the chant, growing brighter with each repetition. He could feel its energy, a tangible force that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ritual ended. The light faded, and the townsfolk dispersed, returning to their homes without a word. Ethan remained frozen in place, his mind racing. Whatever was happening in somnolence, it was tied to the clock tower, and he needed to find out what was inside. The next morning, Ethan decided to confront the innkeeper. He placed the journal on the counter, his eyes narrowing. "Who wrote this?" he demanded. The innkeeper's smile faltered, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know," she said, though her tone betrayed her. "Don't lie to me," Ethan snapped. "You know what's going on here. Tell me the truth." For a moment, she seemed to struggle with herself, her porcelain mask cracking further. Finally, she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "The tower controls everything," she said. "The light, the hum, the sleep. It's been like this for as long as I can remember. No one can leave because the tower won't let them. What's inside it?" Ethan pressed. The innkeeper shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know. No one does. But you shouldn't go there. It's dangerous." Ethan clenched his fists. He had come too far to turn back now. Before venturing to the tower, Ethan decided to test the innkeeper's claims. He got into his car, which miraculously started this time, and drove toward the edge of town. The road stretched endlessly before him, winding through the forest. For a moment, he felt a glimmer of hope, perhaps he could escape after all. But as he rounded a bend, his heart sank. The road had looped back on itself, leading him straight into the town square. The clock tower loomed overhead, its hands still frozen at 6:13. Ethan slammed his fists against the steering wheel, frustration boiling over. There was no escaping somnolence. That night, Ethan stood at the base of the clock tower, his resolve firm. The journal's words echoed in his mind, "The answers are in the tower." The door was heavy, its iron handle cold to the touch. It creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound reverberating through the empty square. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the walls lined with strange symbols etched into the stone. The hum was deafening here, vibrating through the floor and into his very core. Ethan climbed the spiral staircase, each step echoing like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. As he ascended, the hum grew louder, almost unbearable, and he began to hear whispers, faint, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. When he reached the top, he found himself in a circular chamber. In the center stood a massive, glowing mechanism, its gears turning slowly and emitting the pulsing light he had seen during the townsfolk's ritual. Ethan approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The light seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, drawing him closer. The circular chamber at the top of the clock tower hummed with an unnatural energy, a force that made Ethan's skin prickle and his mind whirl with unease. The glowing mechanism in the center of the room pulsed with life, its gears turning slowly and rhythmically as though it were breathing. He stepped closer, drawn to the light despite every instinct in his body screaming at him to turn back. The whispers that had followed him up the stairs now seemed louder, their indistinct murmurs twisting into half-formed words. He felt as if they were speaking directly to him, pulling him deeper into the town's secrets. As he examined the mechanism, he noticed a strange engraving on the floor surrounding it. Symbols, foreign and unrecognizable, spiraled outward like a web. They were etched deeply into the stone, each one seeming to shimmer faintly in the light. Ethan's fingers brushed the surface of one of the symbols. It was warm to the touch, as though the stone itself were alive. "The clock is the heart." The voice was sudden and clear, cutting through the whispers. Ethan spun around, his breath catching in his throat. A figure stood in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the glowing light. It was the innkeeper, her ever-present smile now replaced with a look of solemnity. "You shouldn't be here," she said, stepping into the light. "Why not?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "What is this place? What's happening in this town?" The innkeeper hesitated, her eyes darting toward the mechanism. "The town needs it. We need it. Without the clock, there is no somnolence." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean? What is this clock doing?" "It keeps us safe," she said, her voice trembling. "It keeps the sleep." The innkeeper's words sent a chill through Ethan. He stepped closer to her, his voice firm. "What do you mean, the sleep? What's happening here?" She glanced at the glowing mechanism again, as though afraid it might hear her. "The clock controls everything. It keeps the town in balance. Without it, she trailed off, her face pale. "We'd wake up." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Wake up? From what?" The innkeeper's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Ethan saw the raw fear in her expression. "From the dream." The words hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, shaking his head. "What are you talking about? This isn't a dream, isn't it?" she whispered. Ethan's mind raced. The journal, the looping roads, the eerie behavior of the townsfolk, it all pointed to something unnatural. But the idea that this entire town was trapped in some kind of dream, it sounded insane. He looked back at the mechanism, its pulsing light almost hypnotic. If this is a dream, then who's dreaming it? "And why am I here?" The innkeeper shook her head. "I don't know. None of us do. But the clock is the key. It's what keeps the dream stable. If it stops, what happens if it stops?" Ethan pressed. Her silence was answer enough. Ethan felt a sudden pressure in his head, a dull ache that made him wince. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the light from the mechanism began to flicker. The innkeeper's eyes widened in alarm. "You need to leave. Now." Before Ethan could respond, the floor beneath them shuddered, and the light from the mechanism flared brightly before dimming again. The symbols on the floor began to glow, their intricate patterns shifting and writhing like living things. "What's happening?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising over the growing hum. "The dream is destabilizing," the innkeeper said, panic creeping into her tone. "You've been here too long. You're not supposed to be here." Ethan's heart pounded as the room seemed to warp around him. The walls stretched and twisted, the air growing thick and oppressive. He felt as though he were being pulled in multiple directions at once. Ethan stumbled down the spiral staircase, the innkeeper's frantic warnings echoing in his ears. When he emerged into the town square, the scene that greeted him was even more unsettling. The townsfolk were gathered again, their faces turned toward the clock tower. But this time, their expressions were not serene. They were twisted in fear and confusion, their synchronized movements replaced by chaotic shuffling. "The clock," one of them murmured, their voice trembling. "The clock is breaking." Ethan pushed through the crowd, his presence drawing frightened glances. The townsfolk seemed to shrink away from him, their murmurs growing louder. "He's the one. He doesn't belong. He's breaking the dream." Ethan ignored them, his focus on the tower. The hum was deafening now, a relentless vibration that made his teeth ache. The light from the clock face flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows across the square. "You need to fix it," a voice said, startling him. Ethan turned to see an elderly man, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "You need to fix the clock," the man repeated, his voice urgent. "If it stops, we all. He trailed off, his expression twisting in pain. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. If the clock truly was the heart of the dream, then stopping it could free the townsfolk and himself. But what would happen to them if the dream ended? Would they wake up? Or would they cease to exist? He glanced around at the townsfolk, their faces filled with fear and desperation. They were trapped, just as he was. But was freeing them worth the risk of destroying everything? The whispers in his head grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging him in different directions. Fix the clock. Stop the dream. Save yourself. Ethan closed his eyes, his fists clenched. He had to decide, and he had to make it now. The ground beneath him shuddered again, and a deafening crack echoed through the air. Ethan looked up to see the clock face splintering, fractures spreading like spiderwebs across its surface. The townsfolk cried out, their voices blending into a symphony of fear. "You don't have much time," the innkeeper's voice said from behind him. Ethan turned to see her standing at the edge of the square, her expression grim. "If the clock stops completely, the dream will collapse. Everyone will be lost. And if I stop it myself?" Ethan asked. She hesitated, then said, "I don't know. But you might survive. You're not part of the dream. You might wake up." Ethan's heart ached as he looked at the townsfolk, their faces twisted in fear and confusion. He didn't want to abandon them, but he couldn't stay here forever. The choice loomed before him, save himself or risk everything to save the town. The air in the town square was suffocating. Ethan stood motionless at the center, the fractured clock tower looming behind him like a specter. The cracks on its glowing face now pulsed with erratic light, casting fleeting, jagged shadows across the gathering of townsfolk. Their faces were eerily blank, yet their eyes brimmed with a quiet desperation. The hum that had haunted him since his arrival in somnolence had risen to a deafening crescendo, as though the town itself were groaning in protest. Ethan's mind raced. The revelation in the clock tower, that the town was some kind of shared dream, had shaken him to his core. But what terrified him more was the knowledge that the clock, the mechanism that sustained this fragile illusion, was failing. He could feel the dream unraveling in the very fabric of the town, streets that now twisted impossibly, houses that flickered between solidity and a ghostly translucence, and the oppressive sensation that time itself was slipping through his fingers. The innkeeper appeared beside him, her ever-calm demeanor now replaced with unease. "You have to do something," she said, her voice trembling. "The clock is breaking. If it stops, we all." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Ethan turned to her, his voice cutting through the cacophony of whispers and the hum of the clock. "If this is a dream, then why do you need me to fix it? Why can't one of you stop it?" The innkeeper's gaze faltered, her eyes darting toward the clock tower. We aren't like you. We're part of the dream. You're not. You're the only one who can make a choice." Before Ethan could respond, the ground beneath their feet shuddered violently. The clock tower let out a thunderous groan as another piece of its face crumbled, raining shards of glowing glass down onto the square. The townsfolk screamed, scattering like panicked birds. Ethan shielded his face from the falling debris, his heart pounding. The whispers in his head were louder than ever, a chaotic symphony of voices overlapping in a relentless barrage of words he couldn't quite make out. But then, One voice cut through the noise. Ethan. He froze. It wasn't just any voice, it was Laura's. His sister's voice. Laura, he called out, his voice breaking. The whispers fell silent, leaving only the hum of the clock and the distant cries of the townsfolk. Then, out of the crowd, a figure emerged. It was Laura. She looked exactly as he remembered, her long auburn hair, her gentle smile, but there was something off about her. Her movements were too smooth, too deliberate, as though she were a puppet on invisible strings. Ethan, she said again, her voice soft yet echoing unnaturally in the square. He stumbled back, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This isn't real, he whispered. You're not real. Laura tilted her head, her expression almost pitying. Aren't I? I've been here, waiting for you. No, Ethan said firmly, shaking his head. You died. I saw it. You. Is that what you think? She interrupted, stepping closer. Or is that just what you've told yourself to make it easier? Her words hit him like a physical blow. Memories of that night flooded his mind, her car spinning out of control, the shattered glass, the sound of his own screams. I couldn't save you, he said, his voice breaking. Laura smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was cold, almost cruel. Maybe you did. Maybe this is where you saved me. Ethan felt a wave of nausea wash over him. What are you talking about? This town, this dream, it's not just for us. It's for you, Laura said. You created this, Ethan. You brought us here. Her words felt like a knife twisting in his gut. No, that's not possible. I didn't. Didn't you? Laura interrupted. She gestured to the clock tower. This is your guilt, Ethan. Your regret. You built this prison to keep us safe, to keep yourself from facing what really happened. Ethan's knees felt weak. He stumbled backward, his mind racing. The journal, the looping streets, the townsfolk's eerie behavior, it all started to fall into place. This is my dream, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Laura nodded. And now it's falling apart. Because you can't hide from the truth forever. The clock let out another deafening groan, and a massive crack split its base. The ground trembled violently, and the light from the clock face flickered wildly. You have to make a choice, Ethan, Laura said, her voice growing urgent. You can keep this dream alive, keep pretending, or you can let it go. But if you let it go... Her voice faltered, and for the first time, Ethan saw fear in her eyes. If I let it go, what happens to you? He asked. Laura hesitated. I don't know. Maybe I wake up. Maybe I don't. But this isn't living, Ethan. For either of us. Ethan's chest tightened. The townsfolk had gathered again, their faces turned toward him. They didn't speak, but their eyes seemed to plead with him. Don't do it, one of them finally said, their voice trembling. If the clock stops, we'll all be lost. Ethan looked back at Laura, his heart breaking. I don't want to lose you again, he said. Laura stepped closer, placing a hand on his cheek. Her touch felt real, warm. You never lost me. I've always been with you. But it's time to let me go. Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he looked at the clock tower, its light dimming with every passing second. The weight of his guilt, his grief, pressed down on him like a physical force. He had to choose, keep the dream alive and stay trapped in this false reality, or let it all go and face whatever waited for him in the waking world. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped toward the clock tower. The townsfolk cried out, their voices a chorus of fear and desperation, but he didn't stop. He climbed the stairs one last time, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the mechanism, it was barely glowing, its movement sluggish. The symbols on the floor pulsed weakly, as though they were fading away. Ethan placed his hands on the mechanism, feeling its warmth. He closed his eyes, his mind flooded with memories of Laura, her laughter, her kindness, her absence. I'm sorry, he whispered. With a final, decisive motion, he stopped the clock. The world around him shuddered violently, and the light from the mechanism flared blindingly bright before vanishing altogether. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Ethan opened his eyes to find himself standing in the middle of an empty void. The town was gone. The clock tower was gone. And Laura was gone. Ethan woke up in his car, parked on the side of an empty highway. The desert stretched out before him, bathed in the soft light of dawn. He sat there for a moment, his heart heavy with a strange mix of grief and relief. As he started the car and pulled back onto the road, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the distance, her auburn hair catching the light. But when he looked again, there was nothing there. The dream was over. Or was it? The stillness of the town was deafening. Ethan stood at the edge of the main street, staring at what remained of somnolence. The streets were no longer endless loops, the houses no longer flickering between real and unreal. Instead, the town seemed frozen in time, caught in an eternal twilight that neither darkened nor brightened. The last hour had been a blur, a rush of revelations, desperate decisions, and impossible truths. Now, as the dust settled, Ethan was left to grapple with the weight of his actions. He could still feel the tremors in his hands from the moment he shattered the dream, his dream, as he now understood it. The townsfolk were gone. Or perhaps they had never been there at all. The faces that had seemed so familiar yet so wrong were now just echoes in his memory, like fragments of a fading nightmare. The whispers, the hum of the clock, the oppressive weight of the looping streets, it was all gone. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that came after a storm, heavy with the knowledge that something irreversible had happened. Ethan turned back toward the center of town. The clock tower, the heart of somnolence, stood fractured and still. Its glowing face, once a beacon of the town's uncanny rhythm, was now dark. The cracks that had spread like veins through its structure seemed to shimmer faintly, as though the remnants of its power were still lingering, reluctant to let go. As he approached the tower, his footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the empty streets. The sensation of being watched hadn't entirely disappeared, though he knew no one else was there. Or was there? At the base of the clock tower, he found the journal. Its leather cover was worn and cracked, the pages inside yellowed and brittle. He hesitated before picking it up, unsure if he wanted to see what it contained now that the dream was broken. When he finally opened it, the pages were blank. The cryptic messages, the sketches of looping streets, the maddeningly familiar handwriting, all gone. He flipped through the pages, faster and faster, until he reached the very last one. There, in faint, almost imperceptible handwriting, were the words, "The dreamer wakes, but the dream remains." Ethan slammed the journal shut, his pulse quickening. He looked around the square, half expecting the townsfolk to emerge from the shadows, their vacant smiles waiting to greet him. But the square was empty. Ethan sat on the steps of the clock tower, the journal resting in his lap. He felt a strange hollowness in his chest, as though the act of breaking the dream had taken something vital from him. He thought of Laura, of her final words before the dream collapsed. "You built this prison to keep us safe." The memory of her voice was sharp and clear, but the details of her face were already starting to blur. Had she been real? Or was she just another construct of his guilt, a figment of his subconscious given form by the dream? The thought was unbearable. He buried his face in his hands, his mind racing. If this was his dream, then why couldn't he remember creating it? Why couldn't he remember how he had ended up in somnolence in the first place? A sudden gust of wind rustled the journal's pages, and Ethan's head snapped up. The air had changed, no longer still and oppressive, but cold and sharp, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and decay. He stood, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, beyond the edge of the town, he saw something he hadn't noticed before, the ocean. The ocean wasn't supposed to be there. Somnolence was surrounded by desert, that much he was certain of. But now, as he stepped out of the town square and made his way toward the horizon, he could see the waves lapping against a rocky shore. The ground beneath his feet shifted from cracked pavement to soft sand, and the air grew colder with every step. The sound of the waves grew louder, drowning out the silence that had filled the town. When he reached the shore, he stopped, staring out at the vast expanse of water. The ocean was dark, its surface churning with a restless energy that mirrored the unease in his chest. And then he saw it, a figure standing at the water's edge, their back turned to him. His breath caught in his throat. The figure was familiar, too familiar. "Laura," he called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Ethan took a hesitant step forward, the sand shifting beneath his feet. "Laura, is that you?" The figure turned slowly, and Ethan felt his heart stop. It wasn't Laura. It wasn't anyone he recognized. The figure's face was blurred, like a smudged painting, their features shifting and impossible to pin down. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded, his voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they raised a hand and pointed toward the ocean. Ethan followed their gaze, and his blood ran cold. Out on the water, barely visible against the churning waves, was a structure. A lighthouse. It was impossibly tall, its light flickering erratically as though it were struggling to stay lit. The sight of it filled Ethan with a sense of dread so profound that he stumbled backward, nearly falling to the ground. The figure at the water's edge began to walk into the ocean, their movements slow and deliberate. The waves swallowed them without resistance, and within moments, they were gone. Ethan stood frozen, his mind reeling. The lighthouse's light pulsed once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the shoreline into darkness. A voice whispered in his ear, so close that he spun around in alarm. But no one was there. The dreamer wakes, but the dream remains. Ethan didn't remember walking back to the town, but somehow, he found himself standing in the square once more. The clock tower was still dark, its face fractured beyond repair. The journal was gone, though he didn't remember dropping it. The streets were empty, the houses dark. But as he turned to leave, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. A figure stood in the doorway of one of the houses, their face hidden in shadow. Another appeared at the window of the inn, their vacant eyes watching him. Ethan backed away, his heart pounding. The figures didn't move, but their presence was undeniable. Somnolence was empty no longer. As Ethan fled the town, the whispers returned. They weren't as loud as before, but they were there, a constant murmur at the edge of his awareness. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, parked where he had left it on the side of the road. He climbed inside, slamming the door shut behind him, and started the engine with trembling hands. As he drove away, the town disappeared in his rearview mirror, swallowed by the desert. But the whispers didn't stop. And when he glanced at the passenger seat, he saw the journal lying there, its cover pristine and unmarked. He didn't open it. He didn't need to, because he already knew what it would say. The dreamer wakes, but the dream remains. Ethan kept driving, the whispers growing louder with every mile. And in the distance, on the horizon, he saw the faint glow of a lighthouse.